The quiet court reporter for 20 years. She sat in the same chair, recording thousands of words. No one looked at her. No one knew her name. Until the night her note saved an innocent man's life. Margaret Chen was just a court reporter. Then she became the silent hero of the justice system. The invisible woman Margaret Chen arrived at Philadelphia County Courthouse every morning at 7:15 a.m., exactly 45 minutes before her shift began. She carried the same worn leather briefcase her father had given her when she graduated from court reporting school 2 decades ago, and she always took the same route through the marble corridors to courtroom 4A-T42. Margaret had perfected the art of invisibility. Her small wire-rimmed glasses, neatly pinned black hair, and muted gray cardigans ensured she blended seamlessly into the courtroom furniture. She had witnessed thousands of cases, recorded millions of words, and observed the full spectrum of human drama unfold before her stenotype machine. The attorneys knew her only as the court reporter. The judges occasionally nodded in her direction. The bailiffs sometimes asked if she needed anything. But to most people in the legal system, Margaret Chen was simply part of the equipment, a human recording device that captured every word spoken in the pursuit of justice. What they didn't know was that Margaret possessed something far more valuable than fast fingers and accurate transcription skills. She had perfect recall, an eye for detail that bordered on photographic, and an intuitive understanding of human behavior that came from 20 years of watching people reveal their true selves when they thought no one was paying attention. Margaret lived alone in a modest 2-bedroom apartment in Chinatown, where she cared for her elderly mother and maintained a small garden on the fire escape. Her evenings were spent reviewing the day's transcripts, not because she was required to, but because precision was her obsession. Every word mattered. Every pause held meaning. Every inconsistency told a story. She had never married, though she'd been engaged once to a fellow court reporter who couldn't understand her dedication to accuracy. "It's just words on paper, Maggie," he'd said. "You act like lives depend on every comma." She had ended the engagement the next day, because she knew something he didn't. Lives did depend on every comma. The case that changed everything. Marcus Williams' case arrived on a gray October morning that felt like any other. Margaret set up her equipment with practiced efficiency, adjusting her chair to the precise height that would allow optimal hand positioning for the long day ahead. She had no way of knowing that this case would test everything she believed about justice, truth, and her role in the system she served. Marcus Williams was 25 years old, a soft-spoken community college student who worked part-time at a local electronics store. He sat at the defendant's table wearing an ill-fitting suit that was clearly borrowed, his hands folded tightly in his lap, eyes focused on the table in front of him. He looked scared, which wasn't unusual. Most defendants did. What was unusual was the way he occasionally glanced at the court reporter's station with what appeared to be gratitude, as if he understood that someone in the room was committed to recording his words exactly as he spoke them. The charges were severe. First-degree murder in the shooting death of Tyler Morrison, Marcus's former roommate and childhood friend. The prosecution's case seemed straightforward and damning. Marcus had been found at the scene, his fingerprints were on the weapon, and his DNA was present on the victim's clothing. He had no alibi for the time of death, and witnesses placed him arguing with Tyler just hours before the shooting. Prosecutor Jennifer Walsh was a 15-year veteran of the district attorney's office, known for her meticulous preparation and aggressive courtroom style. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who had rarely lost a case, and her opening statement left little doubt that she considered Marcus Williams's guilt a foregone conclusion. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Walsh began, her voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty, "the evidence in this case is overwhelming. The defendant, Marcus Williams, murdered his friend Tyler Morrison in cold blood, and the physical evidence will prove beyond any reasonable doubt that justice demands a conviction." Defense attorney David Kim was Marcus's court-appointed counsel, a recent law school graduate who had been practicing for less than 2 years. He was intelligent and dedicated, but his inexperience showed in the nervous way he shuffled his papers and cleared his throat before speaking. Margaret could see the enormous pressure he was under, a young public defender facing a seasoned prosecutor in a case that seemed impossible to win. "Members of the jury," Kim said in his opening statement, "I ask you to remember that in our justice system, the burden of proof lies with the prosecution. My client maintains his innocence, and I will show you that the evidence is not as clear-cut as the prosecutor would have you believe." Margaret recorded every word, every pause, every objection. But as the days progressed, she began to notice things that others missed. Small inconsistencies, subtle changes in testimony, moments when witnesses seemed to be reciting rehearsed lines rather than recalling genuine memories. The first crack in the facade on the third day of trial. The prosecution called their star witness, Sarah Martinez, Tyler Morrison's neighbor and the person who had reportedly called 911 after hearing the gunshot. Sarah was 28, impeccably dressed, and spoke with the kind of precision that suggested careful preparation. Margaret had transcribed Sarah's preliminary hearing testimony 6 months earlier, and she had an unusual habit of mentally reviewing previous transcripts when the same witnesses appeared. It was this habit that allowed her to catch the first discrepancy. During direct examination, Prosecutor Walsh asked, "Miss Martinez, can you tell the jury what time you heard the gunshot?" "It was exactly 11:30 p.m., Sarah replied without hesitation. "I remember because I had just finished watching the late news and was getting ready for bed." Margaret's fingers continued moving across her stenotype machine, but her mind was racing. She clearly remembered Sarah testifying at the preliminary hearing that she had heard the gunshot at 11:45 p.m. The 15-minute difference might seem insignificant to most people, but Margaret knew that in murder cases, timing was everything. She made a mental note to review her transcript from the preliminary hearing when she got home. Margaret never questioned her memory. 20 years of court reporting had trained her to retain verbal information with machine-like precision, but she always verified her recollections against her written records. That evening, Margaret sat at her small kitchen table with the preliminary hearing transcript spread before her. There it was, clear as day. "I heard the gunshot at approximately 11:45 p.m. Sarah Martinez had changed her testimony by 15 minutes. And no one in the courtroom had noticed except the invisible woman in the corner." Margaret poured herself a cup of green tea and considered her options. She could mention the discrepancy to one of the attorneys, but court reporters were expected to remain neutral. She could include a note in her daily transcript, but that would only be seen if someone specifically looked for it. Or she could wait and see if anyone else noticed the inconsistency. She chose to wait, but she began paying closer attention to Sarah Martinez's testimony with each passing day. Deeper into the deception over the next few days, Margaret noticed other troubling inconsistencies in Sarah's testimony. During cross-examination, David Kim asked about her relationship with the victim, and Sarah claimed she had spoken to Tyler Morrison only a few times and didn't know him well. But Margaret distinctly remembered Sarah mentioning during her preliminary hearing testimony that Tyler had helped her move furniture just a week before his death. More concerning was Sarah's behavior outside the courtroom. Margaret had developed the habit of arriving early and staying late, which meant she often observed interactions that others missed. She had seen Sarah having intense, whispered conversations with someone on her cell phone during court breaks, always moving to the most secluded areas of the courthouse corridors. On the 5th day of trial, Margaret witnessed something that sent chills down her spine. During the lunch recess, she was returning from the cafeteria when she heard Sarah's voice coming from an empty conference room. The door was slightly ajar, and Margaret could hear Sarah speaking in urgent tones. "Yes, everything is going according to plan," Sarah was saying. "The kid doesn't have a chance. By the end of the week, this will all be over." Margaret stood frozen in the hallway. In 20 years of court reporting, she had never deliberately eavesdropped on a conversation, but she couldn't make herself walk away. Sarah continued talking, but her voice dropped too low for Margaret to make out the specific words. When the conversation ended, Margaret quickly moved to a nearby water fountain and pretended to be drinking when Sarah emerged from the conference room. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She lay in bed replaying Sarah's words and trying to convince herself that there could be an innocent explanation. But her instincts, honed by 2 decades of observing human behavior, told her that Sarah Martinez was lying about something significant. The weight of knowledge. The prosecution rested their case on Friday afternoon, and the defense began presenting their arguments on Monday morning. David Kim was doing his best with limited resources, but Margaret could see that he was struggling against the mountain of physical evidence. Marcus Williams maintained his innocence, but his testimony was nervous and inconsistent, the kind of performance that often convinced juries of guilt regardless of the actual facts. Margaret found herself in an impossible position. She possessed information that could potentially save an innocent man, but her professional ethics demanded neutrality. Court reporters were not supposed to become involved in cases. They were supposed to remain invisible and objective. But as she watched Marcus Williams on the witness stand, struggling to explain inconsistencies in his story while maintaining his innocence, Margaret felt something she had never experienced in her career: the overwhelming certainty that a terrible injustice was about to occur. That Tuesday evening, Margaret made a decision that would change everything. She reviewed every page of transcript from Sarah Martinez's testimony, documenting every inconsistency, every changed detail, every suspicious moment. She created a detailed timeline showing the discrepancies between Sarah's preliminary hearing testimony and her trial testimony. Then she did something that violated every principle of professional neutrality she had maintained for 20 years. She prepared a summary document outlining her concerns about Sarah Martinez's credibility as a witness. The moment of truth. Wednesday morning arrived with the crisp air of late October. Margaret arrived at the courthouse carrying her usual briefcase, but inside was something that had never been there before: evidence that could change the outcome of a murder trial. David Kim was scheduled to present his closing arguments that afternoon, and Margaret knew it would likely be his last chance to save his client. She spent the morning session recording testimony, but her mind was focused on the decision she had to make during the lunch break. At 12:15 p.m., when Judge Harrison called for recess, Margaret watched David Kim gathering his papers with the defeated posture of a man who knew he was about to lose his first major case. Marcus Williams looked back at his family in the gallery: his mother, grandmother, and younger sister, all of whom had attended every day of trial despite the financial hardship of missing work. Margaret made her choice. "Mr. Kim," she said quietly as the courtroom emptied, "could I speak with you for a moment?" David Kim looked surprised. In the weeks of trial, the court reporter had never initiated a conversation with him or anyone else in the courtroom. "Of course," he said, walking over to Margaret's station. Margaret glanced around to ensure they were alone, then handed him the folder she had prepared. "I need to show you something about Sarah Martinez's testimony," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. David Kim opened the folder and began reading. Margaret watched his expression change from confusion to surprise to excitement as he absorbed the information she had compiled. This is incredible," he said, looking up at Margaret with something approaching awe. "How did you notice all of this?" "It's my job to notice," Margaret replied simply. "Every word matters." The unraveling. That afternoon, David Kim requested an emergency hearing with Judge Harrison. Armed with Margaret's documentation, he presented a motion to recall Sarah Martinez for additional cross-examination based on newly discovered inconsistencies in her testimony. Prosecutor Walsh objected vehemently, arguing that the defense had already had their opportunity to cross-examine the witness. But Judge Harrison, intrigued by the specific nature of the discrepancies Kim outlined, agreed to allow limited additional questioning. When Sarah Martinez was recalled to the witness stand, she appeared confident and slightly annoyed at having to return. That confidence began to erode quickly as David Kim methodically walked her through the inconsistencies in her testimony. "Miss Martinez," Kim began, "you testified that you heard the gunshot at 11:30 p.m., but in your preliminary hearing testimony, You stated it was 11:45 p.m. Can you explain this discrepancy? Sarah shifted uncomfortably. I guess I was mistaken before. 11:30 is the correct time. And you testified that you barely knew the victim, Tyler Morrison. But you also mentioned that he helped you move furniture the week before his death. How well did you actually know him? Not very well. He was just being neighborly. Kim continued his questioning, and with each answer, Sarah's story became more convoluted. Margaret watched from her corner, recording every word as the truth slowly emerged. The breakthrough came when Kim asked about Sarah's current relationship status. Sarah claimed she was single, but Kim produced phone records showing hundreds of calls between Sarah and a number registered to Tom Richards, Tyler Morrison's drug dealer, and a man with a violent criminal history. Miss Martinez, Kim said, are you in a relationship with Tom Richards? Sarah's composure finally cracked. That's personal. Did Tom Richards kill Tyler Morrison? I don't have to answer that. Judge Harrison instructed her that she did, indeed, have to answer. Sarah looked around the courtroom like a trapped animal, and Margaret could see the exact moment when she realized her lies had caught up with her. Tom said it was self-defense, Sarah whispered. Tyler was going to turn him in to the police. Tom never meant for anyone else to get blamed. The truth revealed. The courtroom erupted. Prosecutor Walsh demanded a recess. Marcus Williams began crying with relief, and Margaret Chen continued doing what she had done for 20 years, recording every word of the most dramatic moment in her career. The investigation that followed Sarah's confession moved quickly. Tom Richards was arrested within hours, and under questioning, he provided a full confession. Tyler Morrison had discovered that Tom was selling drugs out of the apartment building where both Tyler and Marcus lived. When Tyler threatened to report him to the police, Tom had killed him in what he claimed was a moment of panic. Tom had then manipulated Sarah, his girlfriend, into providing false testimony that would frame Marcus for the murder. Sarah had agreed, because she was afraid of Tom and believed his story, that it had been self-defense. The physical evidence that had seemed so damning suddenly made sense. Marcus had been at the scene because Tom had called him there under false pretenses. His fingerprints were on the weapon because Tom had forced him to touch it while he was unconscious from a blow to the head. The argument witnesses had heard was Marcus confronting Tom about Tyler's death. After regaining consciousness, Marcus Williams was released immediately, and all charges were dropped. Tom Richards was charged with first-degree murder, and Sarah Martinez was charged as an accessory after the fact. The aftermath, the media attention was swift and intense. The story of the quiet court reporter who had noticed what everyone else missed captured the public's imagination. Margaret found herself labeled the silent hero by local news stations and the guardian angel of justice by the courthouse staff. But Margaret Chen was uncomfortable with the attention. She had spent 20 years being invisible, and she preferred it that way. When reporters called her for interviews, she politely declined. When the district attorney's office wanted to present her with a commendation, she asked them to donate the recognition to the public defender's office instead. Marcus Williams and his family came to see her the day after his release. Marcus struggled to find words to express his gratitude to the woman who had saved his life. I don't know how to thank you, he said, tears in his eyes. If you hadn't spoken up, you don't need to thank me, Margaret replied. I just did my job. Your job saved an innocent man from life in prison, Marcus's mother said. That's not just a job, that's a calling. Returned to normal following Monday morning. Margaret Chen arrived at Philadelphia County Courthouse at 7:15 a.m., carrying the same worn leather briefcase and taking the same route through the marble corridors to courtroom 4A. She set up her stenotype machine with practiced efficiency and prepared for another day of recording the pursuit of justice. But everything was different now. The attorneys nodded respectfully when they saw her. The judges made a point of acknowledging her presence. The bailiffs asked about her weekend. The invisible woman had become visible, and there was no going back to the anonymity she had cultivated for 20 years. Margaret adapted to her new status with characteristic grace. She remained professional and neutral, but she had learned that sometimes neutrality required action. Sometimes the greatest service to justice was breaking the silence that allowed injustice to flourish. 6 months later, Margaret received a letter from Marcus Williams. He had returned to college and was studying criminal justice. Inspired by his experience with the legal system, he wanted to become a public defender to help others who might find themselves in situations similar to his own. "I learned something important during my trial," he wrote. "Justice doesn't always come from the people with the biggest voices or the most power. Sometimes it comes from the person sitting quietly in the corner, paying attention to details that everyone else misses. Thank you for showing me that every person in the courtroom has a role to play in the pursuit of truth." The legacy. Margaret Chen continued working as a court reporter for another 15 years before retiring. During that time, she became known throughout the Philadelphia legal community, not just for her accuracy and professionalism, but for her unwavering commitment to justice. She never again found herself in a situation quite like the Marcus Williams case, but she remained vigilant, always watching for the details that might make the difference between guilt and innocence, between justice and injustice. Young court reporters began seeking her out for advice and mentorship. She taught them about accuracy and neutrality, but she also taught them about the responsibility that came with being the keeper of the official record. "We are not just stenographers," she would tell them. "We are the guardians of truth. Every word we record is sacred, because words have the power to set the innocent free and ensure the guilty face justice." When Margaret finally retired, the Philadelphia County Courthouse dedicated a plaque in her honor. It read simply, "In honor of Margaret Chen, whose dedication to accuracy and justice reminds us that truth often speaks in whispers." Margaret Chen had spent 20 years being invisible, but her legacy would be anything but. She had proven that sometimes the most important person in the courtroom is the one nobody notices, until the moment when everything depends on their willingness to speak up for what's right. The stenographer who nobody saw became the hero everyone remembered. Sometimes, the most powerful voices in our justice system belong to those who rarely speak at all. Sometimes, the person who changes everything is the one sitting quietly in the corner, watching, listening, and remembering every detail that matters. Where are you watching from today? Drop your city in the comments below. If stories like this remind you that justice often comes from unexpected places, hit that subscribe button and become part of our Justice System USA community. Have you ever witnessed someone whose quiet dedication made all the difference? Share their story in the comments. Because here on Justice System USA, we believe every voice matters, especially the ones that whisper truth to power.